One of the most important pieces of code that we will write is the security service. As I briefly mentioned in the previous lesson, the security service is responsible for just about everything security, especially when concerning a user. It's responsible for registering a user. It's also responsible for authenticating a user, as well as logging them in and logging them out. And really, the security service is responsible for determining if a user has already been authenticated. Now, I'm separating authentication and login into two different ideas because they are essentially two different processes. The authentication process is determining if a user has access to our application. And then the process of logging in is setting up that user in order to use our application. There's things that have to occur behind the scenes before the user can actually start using our application. So let's get started by defining an interface. We won't define everything on the get-go, but we can at least start with some things that we absolutely know that our security service needs to provide. So let's start with authentication because that's pretty obvious. We need a username and a password, and this method really only needs to return a Boolean value. So it will return a Boolean value. We can call it authenticate, and it will accept a username and a password. We will need a method to log in, and it doesn't need to return a value. So let's log in, and we want to log in a user. But we also might want to use the login method with a username. So we will also have an overload for that value. If we have a login method, we also need a logout method. And there's really nothing that we need for the logout method because once a user is logged in, we know what that user is. So we don't need to specify that user. We need to know if a user has been authenticated. So this needs to be a Boolean value. And this doesn't have to be a method. This can be a property. So we will make this a property that has a getter. We don't really need a setter in this case. And we can start with that. We still need a method for registering a user, but we will get to that in a moment. So let's write a class that implements this interface, and we will just simply call it security service. Let's add a using statement for our models namespace, and now let's implement our interface. In order to authenticate a user, we first need to retrieve the user from the database with the specified username, and then we can compare the two passwords. So in order to retrieve the user from the database, we need our user service. So let's create a private field, and this can be read-only because we will assign it an object and then we will not reassign it again. And this will be of type iUserService, and we'll just call it _users. And we can inject this through the constructor. So let's first of all add a constructor, and the parameter is going to be of type iUserService, and we'll just call it users. And then we will set that private field. So now in the authenticate method, we first want to retrieve the user. So var user equals _users.getBy. We'll pass in the username. Now, there is a chance that the user with this supplied username does not exist. And if it doesn't, then authentication obviously failed. So if user equals null, then we want to return false. Otherwise, we want to compare the two passwords. Now, our password from the database has already been encrypted. So we need to encrypt the password that we get from our password parameter. But we can use that crypto class, and it has a method called verifyHashedPassword, where we don't have to hash that password. This method will automatically do it for us. And this returns a Boolean value. So we can do return crypto. We need a using statement there. And then it's verifyHashedPassword. The first argument that we need to pass is the actual hashed password. We have that from the database, so that will be user.password. And then the second argument is the password in plain text. So we pass that, and then this verifyHashedPassword will verify that our password supplied to our authenticate method matches the encrypted password that we have in the database. Well, let's move on to the isAuthenticated property. Whenever we authenticate a user and log them in, we need some way to track that a user is indeed logged in, so that whenever they make another request, we know that they are logged in. Well, we can do this through cookies, but not everyone has cookies enabled on their browser. So instead, we can use a session. A session is unique for each individual visitor to our website, and one user's session does not spill over into another user's session. A session is something that we can use to store variables in. So we can create a session variable that contains the user's ID. If there is a value for this ID, then we know that the user has been authenticated and logged in. And if this ID variable does not exist, or if it is null, then we know that the user is not logged in. One way that we can get to the session is through the HTTP context class. HTTP context.current. This gets the current HTTP context where we can access the request, we can also access the response, and we can access the session. And then we can set the user ID session variable if we want to. But, we might not want to use this session. Instead, we might want to supply the session to our security service. So instead of just using this in our code, let's add another private variable. This can be read-only as well, and it is of type HTTP session state. We need a using statement for system.web.sessionState, and we can call this _session. And then we can add another parameter to our constructor, but this can be an optional parameter. So we can do HTTP session state session equals null. And then in the constructor, we can check to see if session is null. And if it is, then we can use the session from the HTTP context. That way we always have a session that we can use. So we first want to go to our login method. And whenever we do log in, we want to set this user ID session variable. So we say _session. This is a collection that we can use with a key value pair. So we can call this user ID, and then we can set that to user.id. And then for the other overload, we can retrieve the user from our user service and get the ID that way. So if our user equals users get by username, and then we can call login and then pass in user. And then in the getter for isAuthenticated, we could check the session for the user ID variable. And if it is not null, then we know that the user is authenticated. And this would work, but we might need the user ID elsewhere because that is a rather important piece of information. So we could add a user ID property to this class that wraps itself around our user ID session variable. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's do public int user ID. This is going to have a getter, which is going to return the integer value of our user ID session variable. So let's do convert to int32, and then we will pass in _session user ID. Now we don't have to check if our user ID session variable is null, because the convert.toInt32 method will convert null to 0. So as long as our user ID is greater than 0, then we know that a user is authenticated. We can also have a setter for our user ID property, where we simply set our session variable to whatever value is supplied. So we will just do equals value. And so in the isAuthenticated property, instead of directly using the session variable, we can use user ID greater than 0. And we don't have this user ID property in our interface, so let's go back to our interface and let's add that. So that is an int user ID, and we have a get and a set. We've implemented just about everything except our logout method. So let's write that code. This is very simple. All we need to do is use our session object and call a method called abandon. That's going to abandon the session. So any session variables that we have are going to be gone, which is essentially logging out our user. So the last thing we need is the ability to register a user, which is essentially creating a user. So this is going to return a user. Let's call it create user. we of course need the username, we need the password, and it would be nice to be able to specify if we want to log in after we create the user. So let's have a Boolean value called login. And whenever we implement this method, we could give login a default value of true, because that's primarily what we will want to do. So after the authenticate method, I'll paste in that signature. Let's put public before it, and then let's add the curly braces. I want to keep things kind of in alphabetical order, so I'm going to move the user ID property to the end of the class. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do inside of the create user is actually create the user. So we will use the user service. We'll call the create method. We'll pass in the username, the password, and we are also specifying the profile. Well, we don't have a profile here to pass to it. But let's look at what Twitter does, because I don't think it allows you to create your full profile whenever you are creating an account. So if we go to twitter.com, we have the login and we have the sign up. It lets you define the full name, but everything else is the username and password. So, we don't really need the profile whenever we create the user. So we can just create a blank profile, and then the user could visit the profile page to change whatever it is that they want to change. And then, of course, we don't have to specify the created date because we set that up to do that. Or do we? Because we get a red squiggly. Now, overload for method create takes 3 arguments. I could have sworn we set this up so that we don't have to do that. So let's go to the user service. And no, we did not put that as null. So that should fix that. Although it doesn't, because it's not set in the interface. Dadgummit. So we will set the created as null in the interface, and then our code will be able to compile. Hooray! Okay, let's also set this as true for the login so that we don't run into that problem again. And I know that we did that someplace else, so we will need to make sure that both the interface and the implementation has that optional parameter. For this login, it's really not that big of a deal. But there was something else. It might have been in the iRibbit service. It is. It's the created. So let's go ahead and set that as null. Let's make sure that the service implementation itself sets created as null. And it does. Okay. So we fixed that little bug. And now we can get back to creating our user. And after we do create our user, we can check login. If it is true, then we can log in the user, and then we will return the user. But we don't need to just create a user. We do need to check if there is already an existing user. And we won't do this inside of the create user. Whatever is going to use our security service needs to call that independently. So let's add a method which we will just call does user exist. This will return a Boolean value, and does user exist. All we need is the username because we will use that to hit our database. If we have a user, then we know that a user does exist. So return, we will use the user's service, get by username, and if this is not null, then the user does indeed exist. So let's add this to our interface because that is something that we will want to have. So bool does user exist, and the only parameter is our username. And that's basically all that we need for our security service. In the next lesson, we're going to start planning out our URL scheme and start writing controllers. And we can use this security service inside of those controllers in order to create our users and also to authenticate and ensure that they have authenticated and been logged in.